There is a dream, deeply embedded in our modern, noisy lives. It's the dream of escape, to leave behind the concrete jungle, the constant sirens, the feeling of being watched by a million strangers. It's the dream of moving to the countryside, to find a small house on a quiet plot of land, surrounded by trees and fresh air, a place where you can hear yourself think, where the silence is a peaceful blanket, and where a close-knit community looks out for one another. It is a dream of safety, of simplicity, of a better way of life. But sometimes that dream curdles into a nightmare. Sometimes the silence isn't peaceful, it's watchful. The isolation isn't a comfort, it's a trap, miles away from any hope of help. And the close-knit community you hope to join isn't welcoming. It's a closed circle, with its own ancient rules, its own dark secrets, and a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders. In the countryside, the nearest monster isn't a creature from folklore. It's the neighbor across the field, the one who watches you from their window but never waves back. These are 3 allegedly true stories, submitted by viewers who sought a peaceful life in the country, only to find a special kind of terror waiting for them in the silence. Our first story comes from a couple, Liam and Sarah, who thought they had found the perfect escape from the city. They bought a historic farmhouse on a few acres of land, hoping to start a family in the peace and quiet of the countryside. They soon discovered that their new community had a very specific and very terrifying way of welcoming new neighbors. Their dream home was not an escape, but an entrance into a tradition they were not prepared for, a tradition that demanded a steep and horrifying price of admission. The silence they sought was not empty. It was filled with watchful eyes and unspoken rules that they were about to break.
My wife Sarah and I saved for 10 years to buy our dream home. We were sick of the city, the crime, the noise, the feeling of being anonymous in a sea of people. We found a beautiful old farmhouse, built in the early 1900s, sitting on 5 acres of land, in a small rural county 3 hours from anywhere. The nearest neighbor was a quarter of a mile down the road. It was perfect. The silence was the first thing we fell in love with. At night, it was so profound, you could hear your own heartbeat. We moved in during the spring, full of hope and plans for renovating the old house and starting a garden. For the first few weeks, it was idyllic. We worked on the house, we took long walks, we breathed clean air. We noticed our neighbors were reserved. People would drive by our property, slow down to look, but no one ever waved. We figured they were just a private, quiet community, and we were content to be left to ourselves. Our first interaction was with an old man named Jebediah, who owned the farm down the road. He stopped his rusted pickup truck one afternoon as I was fixing the fence. He was a gaunt man with pale, watery eyes and a long, white beard. He didn't smile. He just stared at our house for a long moment. "You're the new folks," he said, his voice a dry rasp. I introduced myself, feeling a bit awkward. He didn't offer his name. "This house has a memory," he continued, his eyes still fixed on the upstairs windows. "The land remembers, too. The community. We have our ways, traditions that keep the peace. You'd do well to learn them." Before I could ask what he meant, he just nodded slowly, got back in his truck, and drove away, leaving me with a strange and unsettling feeling. His words felt less like friendly advice and more like a thinly veiled warning, a test I didn't know I was taking. The first strange event happened a week later. We woke up to find a dead crow hanging from our mailbox, tied neatly by its feet with a piece of black twine. I thought it, was a disgusting prank by some local kids. I was angry, but Sarah calmed me down, saying we shouldn't make enemies so soon. I took it down and threw it away, trying to forget about it. But the next morning there were 2 crows, hanging in the same spot, tied with the same black twine. A cold knot of fear began to form in my stomach. This wasn't a random prank. This was a message, a deliberate and escalating signal that we did not understand. We decided to drive into the small nearby town to report it to the local sheriff. The town was one of those places where everyone knows everyone. When we walked into the sheriff's office, the conversation stopped. All eyes were on us. The sheriff was a large, imposing man with the same pale, watchful eyes as old Jebediah. I explained what had been happening. He listened patiently, without writing anything down. When I finished, he just leaned back in his chair and sighed, as if I was a child complaining about a nightmare. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "Son," he said, his voice tired, "you're new here, you don't understand. That's just the welcome committee. They're just testing you. See if you're the right kind of folk. See if you'll respect the old ways." I asked him what ways he was talking about. He just shook his head. "Some things are older than the law," he said. "The land has a balance. The committee keeps that balance. My advice? Go home. Lock your doors. And pray you pass the test. Don't call me about this again." He turned back to his paperwork, a clear dismissal. We were on our own, abandoned by the only authority we thought we could trust. We drove home in a terrified silence. That night, we didn't sleep. We sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the dark, empty road. Around midnight, we saw the headlights. A single pickup truck, driving slowly, without its lights on, pulled up to the end of our driveway. The doors opened, and two figures got out. They were tall and thin, wearing dark work clothes. We couldn't see their faces. They walked to our mailbox, and with a horrifyingly casual efficiency, they hung 3 dead crows this time. Then they just stood there, for a long, silent moment, 2 dark sentinels staring directly at our house, at our dark windows. They knew we were watching. This whole thing was a performance, a deliberate act of psychological terror designed for us, the audience. After what felt like an eternity, they got back in their truck and drove away, disappearing back into the oppressive darkness of the countryside. Sarah was in tears, begging me to pack our bags and leave right then. I was terrified, but a stubborn, angry part of me refused to be chased out of our dream home by some local bullies and their bizarre, superstitious rituals. I decided I would confront them. It was a foolish, city-bred decision, the worst mistake of my life. The next day, I bought a high-powered hunting spotlight. That night, I waited. When the truck arrived and the 2 figures got out, I was ready. As they approached the mailbox, I threw open the front door and hit them with the full, blinding force of the spotlight. For a split second, I saw their faces, and my blood ran cold. They weren't kids. They were grown men, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes wide and dark in the sudden glare. One of them was old Jebediah. The other was the sheriff. They didn't look surprised. They looked disappointed, like I had failed their strange, unspoken test. Jebediah raised a hand to shield his eyes, but he didn't move. "You shouldn't have done that, son," he rasped, his voice carrying a chilling note of finality across the yard. "You failed to listen. You failed to understand the balance." The sheriff just shook his head slowly, a sad, grim look on his face. They got back in their truck and drove away, leaving the crows unhung. For a moment, I thought I had won, that I had scared them off. The silence that followed was different, though it was no longer a test. It felt like a verdict had been delivered, a sentence passed upon us. The next morning, the real horror began. It wasn't crows this time. On our front porch, placed neatly in the center of the welcome mat, was a small, crudely made wooden box. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black cloth, was the collar of our neighbor's dog, Buster, a friendly golden retriever who would sometimes wander onto our property. The collar was stained with fresh, dark blood. It was a promise, a clear and brutal escalation. They were no longer just sending messages. They were demonstrating their power, their reach, and their complete lack of mercy for those who defied their traditions. We finally understood. The crows weren't a threat. They were a symbolic sacrifice, a gift to the land, an offering for a new family's protection. It was a twisted, ancient ritual, and by rejecting it, by showing aggression instead of quiet acceptance, we had broken the rules. We had upset the balance that the sheriff had warned us about. We had proven that we were not the right kind of folk for this community. The Welcome Committee's test was over, and our punishment was just beginning. The box was not just a threat against us. It was a message to the entire community that we were now outside of their protection. We packed our bags in a frantic, panicked haze. We threw everything we could into our car, not caring what we left behind. Our dream home had become a trap, a stage for a horror story we wanted no part in. As we sped down the long gravel driveway for the last time, I saw them, all of them, lining the road, just standing and watching us leave. Jebediah, the sheriff, the woman from the general store, the man from the post office, the entire town. Their faces were passive, their eyes empty and cold. They weren't celebrating their victory. They were simply observing the restoration of the balance, a necessary, regrettable, but ultimately righteous correction. We never went back. We lost the house, we lost all our money, we lost our dream, but we kept our lives. Sometimes, late at night in our new, noisy city apartment, I think about that house. I think about the silence, and I wonder who lives there now. I wonder if they received their own welcoming gift of crows, and I pray for their sake that they understood the message. I pray they had the wisdom to simply accept the gift, to lock their doors, and to become a quiet, respectful part of the community, another family protected by the dark and ancient traditions of the silent land.
Our second story comes to us from a woman named Maria, a recently divorced writer who sought solitude and a fresh start in a remote cabin in the mountains. She found the solitude she was looking for, but it was not the peaceful, healing experience she had envisioned. She discovered that in the vast, open wilderness, there are no locks, no alarms, and no neighbors to hear you scream. She learned that being truly alone also means being completely exposed, and that the most terrifying presence isn't a ghost in the house, but a very real, very patient man watching you from a distance, slowly closing the gap between his world and yours, one day at a time.
After a messy and painful divorce, all I wanted was to be completely, utterly alone. I rented a small, isolated cabin deep in the mountains, a place so remote you needed a four-wheel drive vehicle just to get to the main road. My plan was to spend the autumn there, healing, writing, and enjoying the solitude. The cabin was perfect, nestled in a small valley with a dense forest behind it and a long, sloping meadow in front. Across the meadow, about half a mile away, was a high, rocky ridge that dominated the skyline. For the first week, it was absolute bliss. The silence was my therapy, and the sprawling, empty landscape was my sanctuary. I felt safe. I felt free. I first noticed him on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting on the front porch with my coffee, watching the sunrise. I saw a flash of movement on the ridge across the valley. I grabbed my binoculars, thinking it was a deer or maybe a coyote, but it wasn't an animal. It was a man. He was just standing there, on the edge of the rocks, a tall, thin silhouette against the pale morning sky. He was completely still, and he seemed to be looking directly at my cabin. I felt a prickle of unease, but I rationalized it. He was probably a hiker, just enjoying the view. I waved, a friendly gesture, but he didn't wave back. He just stood there, motionless. He was there again the next day in the exact same spot, and the day after that. It became a strange, one-sided ritual. I would wake up, make my coffee, and look for him on the ridge. He was always there, a silent, unmoving statue, a permanent fixture in my peaceful landscape. The friendly hiker theory began to crumble, replaced by a growing sense of dread. This wasn't a coincidence. He was watching me. I started to feel like a specimen in a glass jar, his patient, silent gaze a constant weight on my shoulders. The beautiful, open valley no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like an arena, and I was the unwilling performer. I tried to ignore him. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my recent trauma was making me see threats where there were none. I started keeping my curtains closed during the day, a futile attempt to reclaim my privacy. But it didn't work. Knowing he was out there, just beyond the trees, was a poison in my mind. The silence of the cabin, once so comforting, was now filled with a tense, heavy anticipation. Every snap of a twig outside, every hoot of an owl sent a jolt of panic through me. Was he getting closer? Was he done just watching from a distance? The fear was a constant, low-level hum beneath the surface of my days. One afternoon, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't live like this. I decided to hike up to the ridge myself, to confront him, or at least to see what he was doing up there. I needed to prove to myself that he was just a man, not some boogeyman my mind had created. It took me over 2 hours to make the climb, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. When I finally reached the spot where I had always seen him, the rocky outcropping overlooking my cabin, there was no one there, but he had left something behind, and it was a message meant only for me. On the flat surface of the rock, there was a small, neat pile of objects. It was a collection of dead birds arranged in a perfect geometric circle. In the center of the circle was a single, freshly picked wildflower, the same kind that grew in the small garden right outside my cabin's front door. The implication was horrifyingly clear. He hadn't just been watching me from this half-mile distance. He had been close enough to my home to pick a flower from my garden. He could get as close as he wanted, whenever he wanted. The ridge wasn't his boundary, it was just his preferred observation post. I ran back to the cabin, my mind screaming with terror. The illusion of safety was completely shattered. The half-mile of open space between us was not a barrier. It was a hunting ground, and I was the prey. I got inside and locked the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the deadbolt. I knew I had to leave. I started throwing my belongings into bags, a frantic, desperate scramble to escape. But as I packed, I glanced out the kitchen window towards the dark tree line at the edge of my property, and I saw him. He was no longer on the ridge. He was standing at the edge of the woods, 100 yards from my house. He was holding something in his hand. I grabbed my binoculars again, my breath catching in my throat. He was holding his own pair of binoculars, and they were pointed directly at me at my window. We were looking at each other. He slowly lowered his binoculars, and for the first time, I saw his face clearly. It was gaunt and weathered, with a long, unkempt beard, but his eyes, they were the most terrifying part. They were wide, pale, and utterly devoid of any recognizable emotion. And then he did something that broke me completely. He smiled. It was a slow, deliberate, and chillingly triumphant grin. The game was over. He knew I had seen him, and he knew that I knew. He took a single, slow step out of the woods and into the open meadow, a clear and deliberate act of escalation. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I grabbed my car keys and my phone and bolted out the back door, leaving everything else behind. I ran through the woods to where my car was parked, my lungs burning, my mind screaming. I didn't look back. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that he was walking, not running, across that meadow, savoring his victory. I made it to my car and peeled out of there, spraying gravel, not slowing down until I hit the paved highway an hour later. I drove straight to the nearest police station, a hysterical, sobbing mess. I told them everything about the man on the ridge, the dead birds, the wildflower. They took my statement, but their expressions were filled with a weary skepticism. A creepy hiker wasn't a crime, they explained. There was no direct threat. They sent a patrol car up to the cabin a few hours later, but of course they found nothing. The man was gone. The pile of birds was gone. It was as if it had never happened. The police report officially lists the incident as a possible trespass by an unknown transient. They subtly suggested that I was overwrought from my divorce, that I had let the isolation get to me and had imagined the more sinister details. But I know what I saw. I know he was real. The rental company broke my lease, and I never went back to that cabin. I moved into a noisy, crowded apartment in the heart of the city, and I have never felt safer. I will take the sound of sirens and traffic over that profound, watchful silence any day of the week. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself looking out my high-rise window at the thousands of other lighted windows across the city, and I think about him. I wonder if he's still out there, in that vast, empty wilderness standing on his rocky ridge. I wonder if someone else has rented that little cabin, another soul looking for a peaceful escape, and I wonder if they've started to notice the silent, patient man who stands and watches them from the skyline, the man who is just waiting for the right moment to walk down from his perch and leave a small, thoughtful gift on their doorstep. The most terrifying part of my ordeal is a question that I can never answer. How long had he been watching me before I first noticed him? Had he been there from the very first day, a silent observer of my peaceful new life, patiently waiting for me to look up and see him? The thought that my week of blissful solitude was actually a week of being unknowingly stalked is a horror that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The silence of the country is not peace. It is an absence of witnesses, a perfect stage for a predator to play his games. I now understand that true fear isn't a sudden fright in the dark. It's the slow, creeping, and undeniable realization that you are not alone and that the person watching you has all the time in the world. He was not a monster who attacked in the night. He was a psychologist who understood that the real terror lies in the anticipation, in the slow, methodical dismantling of a person's sense of safety. He didn't need to break down my door. He just needed to stand on a hill and wait for my own mind to do the rest of the work for him.
Our final story tonight comes from a young family, David and Emily, who moved their 2 children out of the suburbs. seeking a safer, more wholesome environment in a remote, tight-knit farming community. They bought a charming house on the edge of town, excited to become part of a place where neighbors still looked out for one another. They soon discovered that their new neighbors did, in fact, look out for each other, and they looked at newcomers with a deep, unwelcoming suspicion. They learned that some communities are not bound by law, but by ancient, unspoken covenants, and that the price of breaking those covenants is a terrifying and absolute isolation.
My wife Emily and I made the decision to move for our kids. We wanted them to grow up somewhere safe, somewhere they could ride their bikes without us worrying. We found a small, idyllic town called Havenwood, nestled in a valley and surrounded by rolling farmland. It seemed perfect. The houses were well kept, the people we met at the local diner were friendly, and the crime rate was virtually zero. We bought a lovely two-story house on the very edge of town, bordering a vast, dark forest that stretched for miles. It was our forever home, a place to put down roots. The community, we thought, was the biggest selling point. We were wrong. The first sign that something was amiss was the bells. On our first night in the new house, as the sun began to set, a low, resonant bell began to toll from the church steeple in the center of town. It wasn't a call to prayer. It was a slow, rhythmic, almost mournful tolling that continued for about 5 minutes and then stopped. We thought it was a charming, old-fashioned tradition. But we quickly noticed that as soon as the bells started, the entire town changed. The few kids playing in the street immediately ran inside. Doors were closed and locked. The town went from a bustling, friendly place to a ghost town in a matter of minutes. We asked our next-door neighbor, a pleasant-looking woman in her 60s named Carol, about it the next day. When we mentioned the bells, her friendly demeanor vanished. A guarded, fearful look came into her eyes. "Oh, that's just the evening bell," she said, her voice a little too casual. "It's an old tradition. Just means it's time to be inside for the night. Safer that way." Before we could ask what she meant by safer, she made a hasty excuse about a pie in the oven and hurried back into her house, leaving us with a feeling of deep unease. The evening bell was not a tradition. It was a curfew. A few nights later, our son, 8-year-old Leo, was in the backyard playing on his new swing set. We got distracted with unpacking and we lost track of time. The evening bells began to toll. Suddenly, we heard a frantic pounding on our front door. It was Carol, our neighbor, her face pale with genuine panic. "Your boy!" she gasped, pointing towards the backyard. "The bells have rung! You have to get him inside! Now! It's not safe!" Her terror was infectious. I ran out back and scooped up a confused Leo, carrying him inside just as the last bell chime faded into silence. Carol gave us a look of grim relief and then hurried back to her own home. We were completely bewildered. What could possibly be so dangerous in this peaceful little town? The next day, I drove into the town's small municipal building, determined to get a straight answer. I found the town clerk, an old man who looked like he had been there since the town was founded. I asked him about the evening bell and the strange curfew. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and looked at me with sad, tired eyes. "Some things are just the way they are," he said cryptically. "Havenwood has an arrangement, a covenant, you might say. We keep to ourselves after dark, and what's in the woods keeps to itself. It's a balance. It has kept this town safe for 200 years. He wouldn't elaborate. He just repeated that as long as we were inside when the bells rang, we would be perfectly safe. He spoke about the things in the woods with a calm, matter-of-fact tone that was far more terrifying than any panicked warning. It wasn't folklore to him. It was a simple, non-negotiable fact of life in Havenwood. The woods that bordered our property, the beautiful forest we had admired, was not a park. It was a border, a line that was not to be crossed after dark, neither by us nor by the things that lived within it, whatever they were. That night, our curiosity got the better of our fear. We put the kids to bed, turned off all the lights in the house, and waited by the large picture window in our living room that overlooked the backyard and the dark tree line. The bells began to toll. The town fell silent. We watched, our hearts pounding, for almost an hour. Nothing happened. We were just about to give up, to dismiss it all as some bizarre local superstition, when we saw them. At the very edge of the woods where the trees met our lawn, a pair of eyes blinked open. They glowed with a faint, pale, phosphorescent light, like a deep-sea creature. Then another pair of eyes opened next to the first, and another, and another. Soon, the entire edge of the forest was dotted with dozens of these silent, glowing, and unblinking eyes, all staring directly at our house. They were at different heights, some low to the ground, some impossibly high up in the branches of the trees. They were not the eyes of any known animal. They were just there, watching, waiting. They made no sound. They just observed us, a silent, luminous jury on the edge of our property, judging the new family who had moved in next to their ancient, sovereign territory. We spent the rest of the night huddled in our basement, too terrified to even look out the windows again. The next morning, the eyes were gone. There were no tracks, no evidence that anything had been there at all. It was as if they were ghosts, ephemeral observers who vanished with the morning light. We knew we couldn't stay. This wasn't a life we could live, being prisoners in our own home every single night, living in fear of a threat the town had simply accepted as a part of their daily existence. Our dream of a safe, wholesome life for our children had become a nightly siege. We put the house on the market the next day. The news traveled fast in a town that small. Carol, our neighbor, came over that afternoon. She looked sad. "I'm sorry it didn't work out," she said, and I could tell she was sincere. Not everyone is cut out for the quiet life here. It takes a certain kind of person to understand and respect the balance. She explained that the covenant was as old as the town itself. The first settlers had made a deal with the original inhabitants of the woods. The town would never cut down the forest, and its people would cede the night to them in exchange for peace and protection. The Watchers, as she called them, were simply fulfilling their end of the bargain. They were the town's protectors, its silent, nocturnal guardians. They watched every night to make sure the covenant was being upheld, to ensure the border between their world and ours was being respected. The bell was not a warning of danger. It was a signal of respect, a nightly acknowledgement of the treaty. By leaving our son outside after the bell, we had not just endangered him, we had shown a profound disrespect to the guardians of the town, an act that could have broken the 200-year peace. We sold the house at a huge loss to a young couple from the city who were just like us, full of the same dreams of a peaceful country life. We didn't tell them about the bells or the Watchers or the ancient covenant. What could we say? Who would believe us? As we drove out of Havenwood for the last time, I felt a profound sense of failure, but also an overwhelming sense of relief. I glanced back at the town in my rearview mirror. The church steeple stood tall against the sky, its bell silent in the midday sun, a quiet promise of the curfew that would come with the setting sun. Sometimes I wonder about that couple who bought our house. I wonder if they hear the bells toll in the evening. I wonder if they've learned to get their children inside before the last chime fades away. And I wonder if they ever stand by their dark windows at night, looking out at the tree line and see the silent, glowing eyes of the town's ancient and mysterious protectors, the Welcome Committee, watching them from the darkness. I hope, for their sake, that they understand they are not just homeowners. They are keepers of a fragile and terrifying peace. The experience taught me a valuable lesson. Some communities are close-knit for a reason. They are bound together not just by friendship, but by a shared, secret burden. Their traditions are not quaint customs. They are survival mechanisms, rules for a game that outsiders don't even know they are playing. The silence of the country is not always peaceful. Sometimes it is the sound of a very old, very delicate, and very dangerous agreement being honored. And the last thing you ever want to do is be the one who breaks the rules of that agreement. I now live in a suburb with streetlights and noisy neighbors, and I have never been happier. I will take the sound of a late-night argument through the wall over the sound of that profound, watchful silence any day. The fear I felt in Havenwood was a unique and primal one. It was the fear of being an outsider, an intruder in a place with ancient rules I did not understand. It was the fear of what happens when you disrespect the local customs and the locals, along with their silent guardians, decide that you are no longer welcome in their town.